How can the same thing that made you super successful in the past 10 years be the thing that is going to make you irrelevant in the 10 years to come? For those of you that don't know me, my name is Gabriel Fairman. I'm the founder and CEO of BureauWorks. Stick around and find out. Localization managers for the past 10 years have been following a very standardized playbook for the most part. And obviously, I'm generalizing, but what this playbook consists of is learning certain best practices around localization. And these best practices are typically developed by certain large companies, for instance, in the 80s and early 90s by IBM, followed by Microsoft in the mid 90s to early 2000s, followed by Google in the mid 2000s to 2010s. And these standards have certain premises that people would learn, right? So I'll talk about a few of them. For instance, separating tech provider from language provider. That's one premise that a lot of people go by in this playbook. Another premise that people go by in this playbook is, for instance, the translation, editing, proofreading process. That's something that the text, in order to achieve quality, needs to be translated by person A, reviewed by person B, and then proofread by person C in order to meet or exceed certain quality standards. The other thing that is very typical in this playbook is catering to local markets. So if you're a localization manager and your main clients internally are the local markets, so like you're typically managing translations centrally, but the people that are consuming these translations are typically marketing managers, employees in country A, country B, country C. These people are typically the measure of your success. So if you're getting complaints from these people, your job is not going well. And if you're getting compliments from these people, your job is going really well. So typically the playbook is all about structuring processes in a way that keeps these people happy. And that's been the case for over the past 10 years. And for the most part, for a localization manager to be successful, as long as these key stakeholders, the people in these specific countries, were giving you a thumbs up, and as long as you could present a compelling case to your management over all the structure that was created around keeping these people happy, you were in for a job, even for a promotion, because that's what people wanted. People wanted predictability. People wanted stability. People didn't want complaints. And as long as you were able to maintain that, no matter the cost, again, keep in mind that localization compared to other efforts is very inexpensive. So let's say if you have a company that maybe spends $30 million in marketing every year, maybe they're going to spend $1 million. $2 million in translation. So the localization process itself is by design a lot less expensive than other initiatives that typically companies engage in. So let's say even if the process is highly ineffective and they're spending $2 million instead of $1 million, that's typically not going to raise too many eyebrows from management. So this modus operandi, this way of working, it's been highly effective. And so localization managers have been basically going to conferences, talking to each other, referencing in these industry best practices and really drilling them into the organization without a lot of concern over, is this the fastest way? Is this the less expensive way? Is this the way that's going to allow my company to most scale? So you almost have a little bit of a conflict of interest, which has been fine for the past 10 years, where the localization manager's main purpose is to not rock the boat, to keep people happy, whereas the company typically, at least most companies, have as their mandate to make the most amount of money for the least amount of cost, right? That's typically how companies work. And what's interesting with all of this AI revolution is that localization has fallen smack down in the center of a lot of executives. And the same strategies that made these localization managers successful in the past 10 years are the strategies that are going to make them fail in front of these executives. So in the past, as long as you were able to be a good manager, hire good vendors, produce good PowerPoints and reports, and show management the results of your work, and basically the main result is keeping the markets happy, you were in a great position. But now managers, they're looking at this from a very different point of view. They're questioning, first and foremost, why do we need this? Why are we spending so much in this? Why can't a model just do it? And obviously, I'm not proposing that these things are possible. I'm just exemplifying what I see on a daily basis coming from localization, not localization people, but from executives managing localization people. So now you have this different perspective on what localization does, on what its purpose should be, on what success looks like. And the challenge is that a lot of these localization managers have learned throughout the years to keep things stable, to keep things predictable. And that is the opposite of what's necessary in now and in the years to come. What's necessary now in the years to come is incredible change management capacity, because all of these structures that were put in place, all of these very, very structured approaches, they're no longer the same approaches that are going to lead people to success. So a lot of these dogmas, right? Sometimes they're right. Sometimes they need to be revisited. For instance, translation editing and proofreading is required to achieve maximum translation quality. Right now, I would say false. That's not necessary. With a good context-sensitive engine like BureauWorks, you can achieve, for instance, the same level of quality, quote unquote, from a single human reviewer who's aided by semantic agents, who's getting very refined feeds from context sensitive. So that's no longer true. And if you do that, let's say maybe you can cut your time to market from 5 days to 2 days. That's a big thing for most companies, being able to reduce time to market in over 50%. Maybe you can reduce translation cost from 2 million to 1 million. Right? That could be a big thing for a lot of companies to be able to save 1 million. And again, maybe in the past that wasn't a thing, but right now, in my opinion, most companies are looking at cost in a very different way than they were looking at cost when we were living that zero interest phenomenon for many years in the US, right? Right now, most companies are very concerned about how much they spend. Most companies are in layoff mode. They're not really, and maybe they're growing specific parts of the business, but most companies are very conscientious about cost right now. And that raises another thing. What is quality, right? So localization quality for so long was based on the source. How much does the proposed translation respect or deviate from the source? And all kinds of error typology schemas were created on top of these, all types of standards, all types of frameworks. But right now, in my opinion at least, translation quality is much more about how does the text perform than how close it is to the English. Maybe my translation is very different from the English, but it performs amazingly well. Maybe it's very similar to the English source, and I'm just saying that English is a source as an example, and maybe it doesn't perform that well. So now, in my opinion, quality is shifting towards performance. So if you're a localization manager that has ingrained this dogma of quality as a framework that compares source to target and creates error typology around these changes, you're probably not going to be able to be very flexible, because looking at performance will unlock a whole other possibility of flexibility in terms of how you treat quality management. The other example is whether or not you have to separate things, for instance, from tech to services, etc. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. The key thing is, in the past, right, if you look at how a lot of these localization managers would operate, it was basically just pick from the shelf the biggest or the most reputable vendor so that you would be in a safe place. But often what's happening is a lot of these bigger or more reputable vendors, they're also in a kind of conflict of interest, where if they introduce true AI disruption, now maybe the same revenues that they were having are going to be chopped in half, or by even more than that. And it's not necessarily advantageous for them to propose that. So now you have these larger vendors who are operating on legacy frameworks, who need to maintain a certain revenue stream and are not incentivized to cut their own revenue stream. So again, the same playbook that would typically be amazing. Okay, I chose the number one vendor, the number two vendor, I chose the biggest, the boldest, whatever. That's typically not necessarily going to drive you to the results that you're looking for. And now we come to the bigger mindset shift here, which what I was talking is change management. So change management is a very boring term to describe what I find perhaps the most fascinating thing about management in general and about what's going on in our space. So in our space right now, what's really, really important is to change completely the way people operate. So let's say you have vendors on your team and you have translators, and they're used to making their income by log files. So log files are these analyses that compare the source to the whatever you have in the knowledge base and produce a report that's called a log file. And that has been the industry standard for many, many, many years. But now a log file, especially a pre-analysis log file that's based before the work was completed, is very little representative of the actual work that will be performed by the translator. And then you start to get into these forks in the road. Okay, so the pre-analysis log file maybe isn't that good. Maybe I'm going to use the post-analysis log file. Maybe I'm going to pay them by hour. How do I measure that? How do I do that? How do I propose that? And you start getting there are no perfect answers, right? Let's say you start paying people by hour. How do you make sure that those hours are being well invested? How do you, maybe you can do that with a very small group of trusted vendors, but once you scale that, that becomes really hard to govern if you don't have the right processes and the right tools in place. So you start touching on how you pay people. You start touching on the processes that they follow. And same thing internally as well in the company. So maybe right now your mission isn't anymore to please markets at any cost. Maybe your mission is to drive content as fast as possible at any cost. So these priorities are shifting. And sure, you can stay as a monolith and just try to continue to do the same thing. And in many organizations, that's going to be perfectly fine, because that's another key characteristic of the era in which we are, which is the splintering into the industry into little bubbles, right? There are certain companies that are change averse in general, and they're doing perfectly fine, and that localization is not falling into this deeper level of scrutiny. In other companies, they're looking at cutting localization entirely from the organization. You know, how can we do away with all of this? So depending on the kind of organization that you sit in, the recipe is going to be different. But the key point that I really want to emphasize in this particular video is that change management is the opposite of what has been practiced by localization managers for the past 10 years. It's been the opposite. So most of the dogma around good localization management is don't rock the boat. Don't change things. Don't upset people by introducing change. Don't upset your translators. Don't upset your vendors. Don't upset your markets. Keep people happy. And the way you keep most people happy is by not introducing change. I don't know many people who like change. Change is complicated, change is complex, change is thorny, change is fundamentally uncomfortable. But without change, it's impossible, in my opinion, to be successful in this day and age, because the only way you can explore the potential of most of these tools and models is through change. So I find this fascinating, how the same thing that made localization managers highly successful, which was conservative thinking and change avoidance, is now the thing that are going to keep them in a very complicated place unless they change. But that's my perspective. Would love to hear your thoughts. Thanks so much for watching, and remember, if you like this video, to like and subscribe. Until next time.